G'day, it's Geoff Lewis here from Seriously Series, and welcome to another video inside the Landy Cave. Now, here today I'm actually going to be sharing with you something that I've been researching or looking into for the last 6 months. And this is something I believe that's going to really help improve the cooling system on the Land Rover Series 3. But I'm going to be using Land Rover parts, particularly from the series models. So stay tuned as I show you another interesting little trick to help improve your vehicle. The reason why I'm making this video is because the Series 3 cooling system seems to be struggling in the hotter months here in Western Australia, and it's something obviously I had come across a little bit in the Series 2, particularly driving across Australia with it, but it was a bit of a concern on the Canning stock route. We did have to stop a number of times and actually pull over in the shade. And we found a little trick. Actually, Damon taught me a little trick of leaving the heater box on, or the fan in the heater box, and this would actually cool the coolant down just enough to get it back in the operational range, and then we could go off again. So it was really handy little trick, and that made a big difference. And we pulled the bonnet off too and popped that up on the roof, and that certainly made it a lot easier to work on the motor, but it also made a bit of a difference with the cooling system too. One of the things that people forget when it comes to modifying a vehicle of any nature or any combustion engine is they want more power and they want to use less fuel. But they always overlook the cooling system. If you're going to make that motor work harder, not necessarily for longer, but it's going to be working at a greater intensity, then it's going to generate more heat, and you need to get that heat out of the motor. You need to maintain just enough to keep it operational, but you need to get it just right. So this is something I've thought about quite a bit, and it's something that I've done a lot of research into too. Now, we have done a video on cooling systems and sort of how it's evolved in regards to alloy blocks and using alcohol derived cooling such as glycol coolant. But actual cooling a motor itself has really gone in leaps and bounds in the last sort of probably 40 years, 50 years. Because prior to that, they actually used a thing called siphoning cooling. And this basically works in this principle of, if you've got a pot and you boil it on the stove, let's say you're chucking some spuds in there or something, have a look at it next time and you'll notice that the bubbles, the water actually goes down to the bottom of the pan or the pot, and then the bubbles come up to the top and then they pop, and it just keeps going around in a cycle. And this is called convection. And this is basically what all early cooling systems relied on. They didn't have a fan, they just had that. As motors got more powerful and they had to operate in different environments, this meant that they had to have a more efficient cooling system. And this is where we started seeing fans being used. A lot of early motors actually just had a mechanical fan, and this was literally mechanical. The Howard tractor is a perfect example of this. If any of you know this tractor, it was built here in Australia, it was quite successful. This actually had the fan and the water pump driven off the actual timing chain, so it didn't even have a fan belt. But then moving on, it became quite popular in cars, and we wanted other stuff to run off it too, like aircon units and alternators and generators and all that kind of fancy mumbo jumbo. So what we ended up doing was we ended up creating a water pump on the front of the motor using a pulley and using a triangular belt or a flat belt, and it would sit in here and then go around to the crank, and that obviously would spin the motor. And pretty much this remained the mainstay for many years, but the problem is with what this is called a mechanical fuel pump is it's only spinning as fast as the motor is spinning. So if you're traveling at slow speeds, it's not spinning very fast, which in a hot climate means you're not getting as much air going past the motor and you're not cooling it down as much. So this proves to be quite an issue, and there's a couple ways that you can actually go about it. And I'll just show you one. Just give us 1 minute. Now, the easy thing to do is to look at the back of your radiator, look at the front, and go, I'll just bolt something onto it, something new, something modern, like this. This is a electronic thermofan, and basically you can get some tabs that actually sit in between the cores of the radiator, and these just clip on there. Now, they're not too bad for what they are, but I'm a bit skeptical about chucking one on the Series 3. I've had a look into them. I've seen you can get some cheap ones, you can get some good ones. Good ones you're looking at around about sort of $400 to $600 mark here in Australia, which is probably around about, divide that in half, so probably 300 pounds. So you know it is a considerable bit of kit to actually use or invest in. But so you can get two different types. This one is a pulling fan, so when it turns round, the air is drawn in and is pushed out the other side towards the motor. You can get other ones where the actual pitch of the blade is different, so instead of going like that on that angle, it actually goes back on the opposite angle like this, and that's a pushing fan. So that sits on the front of your radiator, spins around and pushes the air through, and they're quite good. The handy thing about this is I can have this bolted on the car and I can just have a switch inside it, and if I'm working on sand or it's a hot day, I can just flick it on and use it just to get the temperature back down, and just use it intermittently. The problem with this is that, one, it's electronic, and that's fine, but the problem is if you're going through deep water or mud, it's going to get in here and they stop working. The other problem is if you have this on the front of the motor and you're driving down the highway, even on a cold day, or front of the radiator, sorry, it's just going to spin around, and you don't want that to happen. You want to be able to try and warm the motor up on a cold day, not cool it down. The other problem is the tabs that go in between the actual cores of the radiator can actually vibrate, chafe through, and actually do some damage to your radiator. So if you are going to do it, you want to put some brackets to sit it out probably about that much from the actual radiator itself. So that's an option you can go for. But I thought that's a bit boring. Like, why go get something that you can just get off the shelf? Like, there's no fun in that. And all the vehicles here, we try and use parts that Land Rover would have manufactured back in that particular period. It's an argument and it's a question that I come up against a lot. People say, oh well, why don't you just take the 2.25 litre motor from the 1970s, take that out and put in a modern 300 TDI motor in it. And my argument is, well, why stop there? Why not put coils on the front, coils on the rear? Why not put a centre diff lock in it? Oh well, then you've got a manual gearbox. If you've put a manual gearbox in it, why not take that out and put an automatic gearbox in, and then air conditioning, and before you know it, you're sitting in a car with cup holders. Cup holders. Like, slippery slope. When you're getting to putting cup holders in your car, you need to sit down and just calm down a little bit. That's my opinion. So we try and keep everything relatively original and using modifications that were available at the time. So something that I've looked into going through my Series 3 parts catalogue is actually the water pumps. Now this is a housing for a water pump for a 2.25 litre petrol engine, the later type. There's a couple different variations of it. for the housing. There's the military version and then there's the civilian version, and you've got I think the studs variate how many studs are actually used on it. Probably the difference might be between the 3 bearing and the 5 bearing motor. Not sure. If you know, leave a comment down below. So I've looked into it, and what you can actually get, and it's very, very rare that I've found out, is obviously the diesel water pump is different to the petrol model. Now the diesel, I've stripped this water pump apart, has a shaft like this, and I'll just hold this up a little bit closer so you can get a good look at it. Now typically, obviously this is where the propeller sits on, something like that, just for the purpose of this video. We've then got the bearing here, which sits inside the casting in here, seals either side, but it's this bit here at the end that is really intriguing. Now this is known as a spindle. Now this spindle obviously has a thread on it, and for those of you who aren't familiar, the 2¼ litre petrol actually has a flange on here. 4 bolts go in, and the 4-blade fan simply bolts straight onto it, and off you go. Now, something that was available with the diesel variants, particularly the later diesels, as I've found out and been told, was that they had the ability of being able to fit a viscous coupling. This was also something that was available in the 2.6 litre. So what you can actually do is buy an individual spindle. This is actually pressed onto this shaft here, and by pressing that on, you can in turn, just one I prepared earlier, get a fan like this. Now this was actually used on the later diesel models. This is a viscous coupling in here. I'll explain in another video if you're interested how viscous coupling actually works, for those of you who don't know. But basically this viscous coupling, simply with the aid of a different pulley, different pulley to this, sits on here. Now the fantastic thing about the viscous coupling, I'll just pull the shaft out, is when it gets up to, I believe when it gets up to temperature, the fan will actually kick in. Yes, that's right. Yeah, when the motor gets up to a particular temperature, the fan will kick in. Now, you don't have to be a genius to see that this fan is a heck of a lot smaller and less effective than this. This is the same fan that was used on the 200 TDI and the 300 TDI. So this is where it originally started. And this was, I believe, in 1982-83 when this was available. This is obviously an old fan, and obviously an old viscous coupling. You can source these viscous couplings, and you obviously can get the fans quite readily. The fantastic thing about this is that the fan, as I said earlier, will only work when the temperature of the motor reaches a certain point. So you've got the ability of keeping the motor running at its optimum temperature in a cool climate, and running much, much more effectively in a hot, warm climate. Now, a little bit on hot climates, and particularly cars and motors and all the rest. The Land Rover Series 1, the Land Rover Series 3 obviously first came out in the early 70s, discontinued in the mid-1980s. Now, with that, testing of vehicles was a little bit less rigorous than what it is today. Obviously, vehicles are now built for a global market, so they have to be able to... Oh, nearly fell off there. Just put the fan in a safe spot. They have to be able to function in a number of different environments. Most modern four-wheel drives are tested to have the ability to function in temperatures up close to 50 degrees centigrade. But most modern vehicles, and I've even found it in the modern Land Cruisers, getting up around about the mid-40s, they start having overheating issues too, which is no discredit to them. That's actually quite impressive. We were operating in temperatures with the Series 3 around about sort of high 30s to mid 40s degrees centigrade, which is probably, I've got to have a guess, 100 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, something around about that ballpark. So really quite warm. If you're operating in temperatures like that on a routine basis, something that you can also look at doing, and a lot of people do, is getting an oil cooler kit. This actually sits in front of the radiator, and it's just a small radiator, and the actual engine coolant actually goes through the engine's oil, not the coolant, goes through the little radiator itself, and this actually cools your oil down. The problem is, where I'm in Australia, we have a Mediterranean climate, so that means during winter it's around about sort of 15 degrees centigrade to sort of about 25 degrees centigrade. In summer it'll get up to around about 40 to 50 degrees. So it's a big temperature range, and that makes it quite difficult to sort of cater for that. You can buy the oil cooler kits, and you can get them for all makes and models, but they are horrendously expensive. The ones that I've looked that are the proper ones for the Series Land Rovers, you're looking at close to around about $700 to $900 Australian. So it is a considerable investment, and you really need to make sure that it's going to work. It's something that I've sort of put off at this stage. I'm quite keen to see how this fan will actually work and how much more effective it will be. The other thing that you can look at doing is, obviously the biggest thing that makes the biggest difference is the radiator itself. Now the Series radiators changed quite a bit. The Series 2 radiator is different to the Series 3. The Series 3 has a finer core, so that means it has more cores, more stacks of cores in its radiator, and it's one of the cases where bigger isn't necessarily better. The finer the core of the radiator and the more of them that you actually have stacked in together means that you actually have a larger surface area. What does that mean? Well, the bigger the surface area for the air, the incoming air, to actually go over, means that you can cool down the water more effectively. You're still holding the same amount. So you can have a radiator with, let's say, 3 cores and still hold 6.5 litres. But you can have one with 7 or 8 cores holding 6.5 litres. Because they're finer, you've got more of them, you've got a greater surface area, and so therefore it has a greater ability to be able to cool that air down when it actually comes through. So that makes a huge difference. The other difference that you can also get is obviously the different kind of core you use. Now, obviously the Land Rover radiators used a heavy duty core, which you can still get today. It is a bit more expensive. You can fit them with a modern core in the Radiator too, but it's not as durable. But this modern core has the ability of having a better gap. It's a little bit coarser in the actual overall mesh of the core and how it's joined together, so you can get a greater flow of air through it too. So that's something to look into also. Over time though, the radiator does fill up with gunk. It fills up with mud, it fills up with sludge from the motor, and if you're not changing your coolant on a regular basis, or you're just using water, then this will obviously affect the effectiveness of your radiator. So that's something that needs to be looked at too before you start, ripping stuff apart and going crazy. I've used the new radiators that you can get for the Series Land Rovers. The Series 2 has one in it. It works quite well. It is actually not too bad, and they are quite good for your money. If you're on a budget, I'd highly recommend going down that road. However, if you've got the money to spend, I'd really recommend keeping your original radiator and getting it recored. I've just found the new ones aren't quite as effective in off-road situations as the older ones are. I don't know why. I've got to look into it a little bit more, and when I find out, I'll let you know. But the other thing is too, with the radiators, is they've got a top. The actual top of them is flat, and this actually causes them to flex quite a bit. So when you actually look at actually getting it rebuilt, one of the things you want to ask the company that's actually doing it for you is, one, have they dealt with these radiators before? Two, can they actually build up the inside of the top of the tank? Because you've actually got little depressions in the top of the tank, and where this little depression reaches its apex or its lowest point is generally where it flexes, and that's where you get pinholes coming through. So if they can put a bit of solder or weld across there and actually thicken it up a little bit, you'll never ever have to worry about your tanks actually leaking on the radiator. So that's another really good one to look at too. One thing I'd be skeptical about is going for alloy radiators, purely because from my own experience, alloy radiators are very good, they're very cheap, they're very effective, but they have one major drawback, and that's the fact that they're made out of alloy. The reason why it's a problem is because alloy is obviously a mixture of two metals, and you have to look at what those two metals are in that alloy, because that is going to obviously govern how it will actually function. So for example, on a Land Rover or a Volkswagen Beetle, they use a aluminium magnesium alloy. It's light, it's tough, it's durable, and it's flexible, but it stretches, it warps very easily. Now if we get steel and we mix it with titanium, then it'll be really strong, but it's going to be quite brittle. And the biggest thing that I've seen with alloy radiators is particularly the top tank and the bottom tank and around the pipe, where the pressure is at its greatest. This is where they get fatigue fractures, and ultimately this is where they break and they let you down. So just double check, make sure you read up on your forums, your reviews, and have a chat to a few people before you look at going down that road. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I just thought it might be something that might be of interest to a few of you out there. The thing I like about the setup that I'm looking at going for here, and I've got a bit to do on the workbench here, is that once again we've used all original Land Rover parts on it. Yes, you wouldn't have been able to get it on particularly on a 1975 Land Rover Series 3, but you could get it on a Series 3. And it means I'm not having to butcher the car too much by having to fit, thermo fans on it, which these do last quite a while, but you probably get 5-10 years and then you have to replace it. And then you've got to make new brackets because you can't get that model of fan anymore, and rah. So I'm quite happy with the setup that we've got here, and it's going to be really interesting looking at how effective it is, particularly in the warmer months, and particularly doing slow off-road work on sand. So we'll be sure to do a bit of an update video down the track, because there is a lot going on with the Series 3 at the moment. I've just done an update workshop video showing what's going on with all the vehicles, and the Series 3 as always has got a lot of extra modifications and refinements going on with it. But as many of you know, and probably if your partner's sitting there watching the video, they'll roll their eyes, a Land Rover is never finished, and it's very much like a Land Cruiser in that regards, particularly a FJ40. They just don't leak as much oil, but there's always something to do. Anyway, I'll catch you in our next video. Thanks for watching, and if you want to support the generation of content here on Seriously Series, please join us on Patreon, and I hope to catch you there.